we can think all these things to make the world better, to make people better, why hasn't God done these things? I mean, if there's an all-good God, it seems that He would have done these things. So that's the real question, is that, boy, it's so easy for us to think how the world could be so much better just by tweaking the way people are and changing some things about the world and intervening more and making your presence known. Why isn't God doing that? And since God isn't doing those things, then the question is, should we even believe there's such a God? Because it seems that if God's all good, He would want to make things better for us. And if God was all powerful, God would have the ability to do so. And if God was all-knowing, then He certainly knows what's going on the planet, and He certainly knows how He set up the planet to function, right? So the fact that we have all this evil, misery, and suffering on earth, it seems to be inconsistent with an all-good God. So this point is to lead into the argument from evil. We really kind of just made the argument from evil with our list. So, but let's look at the argument from evil. So the argument from evil, we can actually, there's different ways to say it, so I'm going to give you one of the versions that I think is actually the best way to look at it. There's a lot of evil, misery, and suffering in the world. Premise 2, an all-good, all-powerful, and all-knowing God would not allow so much evil and misery and suffering, therefore no such God exists. It's a pretty easy argument, and yet every theologian, every religious person or leader realizes this is a tough argument to overcome. So there's a lot of evil, misery, and suffering in the world. I don't think anybody could really challenge that unless you have your eyes closed to what's going on in the world. And it's certainly in past times, it was even more true. We talked about that. But even today, we go to parts of the world, there's an awful lot of evil, misery, and suffering. And, okay, by the way, an all-good, all-powerful, what's the word that they usually use for this word? Omnipotent. And what's the all-knowing? What's the word? Omniscient. Okay, so there are words they usually use in religion. They usually talk about God as omnipotent, omniscient. They usually say all good. They don't say omnibenevolent, but I guess you could use that word, but I've never really seen it. Okay, so God's all good, all-knowing, and all-powerful. But if you're really all good, you wouldn't want there to be so much evil. If you're all-knowing, you know there's a lot of evil. And if you're all-powerful, you could do something about it. So the fact that there is so much evil, misery, and suffering seems to be inconsistent with such a God, and therefore we should believe there is such a God. Let's get this, let's motivate this. By the way, sometimes we can add something. Maybe we should say, an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing God will not allow so much evil, misery, and suffering. And we can add here, and certainly not allow any unnecessary evil. Maybe we should add that to it. And certainly not add, okay, so we're going to talk in a few minutes what unnecessary evil means, all right? Well, let's kind of motivate this. So if somebody, let's say a baby crawled away from its parents, crawled down the street, it had just rained, and actually crawled into a puddle of water and started drowning. And these things happen, right? And these kids, when they can crawl, they get away fast. I mean, it's hard. Are you a parent? You know? Yeah, so you know that, right? It's just kind of amazing. What happened to my kid? They're in the room. They crawled there. All right. So let's assume there's a person right next to where the baby is. And the person says, oh, wow, there's a baby drowning. You don't see the parents around. And so you kind of have to act. You have a choice, either let the baby drown, do nothing, or it's real easy, just let the kid out of the puddle, the kid's alive, right? If the person chose not to help the kid and just said, what do I care, I don't know the kid, let the kid die, what would you think of that person? Horrible. I mean, I would call that a moral monster. I mean, what, you don't care about a little kid who's innocent, has never harmed you, hasn't done anything bad yet? Wouldn't you think it's horrible? But think about it. Isn't that the position that God is? God is in the position, He sees all this horrible evil, misery, and suffering. He sees kids born with terrible diseases that they die from very quickly. He sees wars where they murder little children. And yet He doesn't do anything. He allows it to happen. he seems to be in the same situation. Not only does he not seem all good, it seems like he is a moral monster. He sees all this evil, misery, and suffering. He could do something about it. He doesn't do it. He's all good. He'd want to do it. Well, what do you think? Well, how could there be a God like that? It doesn't really make any sense. Do you guys see the argument? Yes?
I was going to say, like, but God is God. How could we, as humans, as creations, be able to say, oh, his morals are wrong?
Well, look, we're talking about should we even believe there's such a God. That's kind of a cop-out.
Okay.
Well, it's all in God's knowledge. Well, you know what? We're not dummies. I think we can use our rationality to think if something really makes sense. So the whole point is what we're doing in this class is we're questioning whether we should believe there's a God. You can't just say, you're assuming already there's a God, so we can't question. But I'm saying, well, wait a second, does it really make sense there's such a God? I don't think so. It's not enough to just say, somehow I don't understand it, but it must be right. Well, why does it must be right if you can't really understand it? I guess that's what we're, right? You understand what we're doing here?
Yeah.
It's a philosophy class.
I'm just being
It's okay, you're doing good, very good. All right, so we want to make a couple of distinctions. We want to make a distinction between natural evil and moral evil. So what's natural evil? Well, it's just bad things or evil that occurs naturally. So all the natural disasters, we might call them natural evil, because they kill people. Earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes. But we'd also include things in natural evil like, diseases. Diseases kill people. That's a natural evil, certainly for us. And then moral evil, what we're talking about is kind of evil or bad things people do to each other, like somebody who murders someone else. That's moral evil. So there is natural evil and moral evil in the world. Philosophers think it's important to distinguish these. And if we actually look at the history of the world, what we could say is the great majority of deaths and the great majority of sickness and diseases and injury have to do with natural evil. The moral evil is even though we've done a lot of horrible things, we've had wars and wiped out, genocide, whole groups, it actually is a very small percentage of the total suffering and deaths in the world. Natural evil actually accounts for much, much more of it. So there's been a lot of kind of studies and estimations of that. So, Hume, you guys remember Hume? We mentioned Hume a lot, the problem of induction, all that. Hume actually wrote about this, and he just kind of motivates. He says, look, there's a lot of evil, misery, and suffering in the world. People, think about when you're a baby, you're born weak and impotent. That means no power, right? He says, the strong on our earth kill the weak. There's a lot of mental grief, shame, guilt, and rage. People harm other people. There's diseases, war, famine, and catastrophes such as hurricanes, tornadoes, and earthquakes. He says, now remember, Hume lived in England in the 1700s. He says most people live in poverty and work really hard. That was true then. It's not as true today, but in those days it was really true, and it's certainly true in a lot of places in the world. And he says, look, most people are afraid of death. And then he says, if an alien, can you imagine they had this idea, an alien? If an alien came down and observed our world, he would say, oh my goodness. But Hume didn't quite write like that, but there's a lot of evil, misery, and suffering. It looks pretty bad down here. And Hume even says, nobody would live their life over again with the exact same experiences. Remember eternal recurrence, Nietzsche talked about it. But Hume doesn't think people would choose to do it. And so Hume says there's an awful lot of evil, misery, and suffering, and he does think it's inconsistent with an all-powerful God. All right. So let's try to, yes?
Sorry, would death by old age be a natural evil, or is that in a different?
Yeah, it's a natural evil. Well, if you think that's an evil by old age. As I'm getting older, I definitely think it's an evil. You're not worrying about it too much. You guys are young. Okay, death by old age. On the other hand, I guess it's better than death by young age. All right, okay. All right, so there are two main defenses that the theist means a believer in God, the theist would make. One is called the free will defense, and the other one the character development defense. So we're going to take a look at this. Now the free will defense really only is dealing with moral evil. It's not dealing with natural evil. So well, let's look, because we've already said moral evil is a smaller amount. So the free will defense, I wrote it up here, is basically a world with free will is better than a world without free will. But with free will comes moral evil. In other words, the argument is God could have made us with no free will. Some people think he actually did, but the argument is God could have made us with no free will, but then what one philosopher said is then we would be like pet animals, just kind of living by instinct without free will, and he doesn't think that's very appealing. Well, I kind of would present it stronger than even he would. I think if we don't have free will, it's almost like you're a computer just running on programming, and you don't have a choice about what to do. It's just it's programmed into you what to do. And I don't know about you, but I find that very unattractive. So I kind of agree with this argument that a world with free will is better than a world without it. You could dispute this, but I kind of agree. A world with free will is better than a world without it. But we know by definition, if you allow people to have free will, you're going to have some moral evil. Why? Because what free will means, you have the free will to do good or bad things, to do really nice things to people, or to do evil things to people. So with free will comes a lot of evil, but it's worth it because the free will is that valuable. You guys understand the argument? Who thinks it's a pretty good argument? I mean, I think it's a very appealing argument, don't you think? Okay, well, we're going to look at how the atheists might respond. So I kind of say, in general, most of these responses are going to be, God could change us to the world so we would still have free will, but there would be a lot less suffering than there actually is. So that's kind of going to be the approach. And what we're going to actually do, if you actually look at the list, but we're going to go through them one by one, it pretty much mirrors a lot of the things we said when we did Let's Play God. All right, the first thing is we need to say this. The free will defense obviously only works if we really have free will. We're going to deal with that issue next time. But a lot of philosophers, the majority of philosophers, and I think the majority of neuroscientists do not believe we have free will. Now, I do believe, in fact, I even wrote an article, I don't know, a year and a half ago that got published on this, and I'm going to share with you my thoughts, but we're going to look at the debate next time, and I'm going to share with you my thoughts on it. So I think we do have free will, but if we don't, you can't make this defense, obviously. This only works if we really have it. Okay, so let's assume we have free will, and then we'll look at the other objections to the argument anyway. The next one is God could have given us a limited free will, so we could do the most terrible things. Well, if you think about it, most of us, it wouldn't change what we do in our everyday life. We would be exactly the same, because I don't think I do any terrible things in my life. But God could make it so you couldn't kill other people. You couldn't cause serious harm to other people. Any of you guys anybody here like science fiction? Anybody ever watch any of the episodes of the original Star Trek? Not all these spin-offs, which I don't think are very good, but the original Star Trek was really good. Well, there was one episode where the people from the Starship Enterprise were fighting some, other, I think they were an alien group, and they kept fighting. I guess the other people would beam above the aboard the Enterprise, and they would fight, and they would actually kill each other, except for as soon as the person died, they'd come back to life. Pretty soon, the people said, "It doesn't make a lot of sense what we're doing here. Why do we keep doing this?" So we're kind of almost saying like this: you really can't kill them, right? In that situation, you really can't kill them. Well, if you really could, now look at it, if you think about it, you could think of a lot of ways to do this. Maybe every time that you actually go to kill someone, your body freezes or your hand freezes. You can't really move your hands. Pretty soon you'll get the message. You know what? I think I got to stop trying to do this. I can't do it. Right? You're God. I mean, you could certainly institute that. Or as soon as you go to torture someone, the same thing happens. If you think about it, the world would have been a much better place for so many people if we just didn't allow killing, right? Or if I were God, one of the things I wouldn't allow is I certainly wouldn't allow people to go to war in the name of God. Something about that seems really bad to me. I'm going, what are you doing? You're killing my creations, other people, in my name. I'm not going to allow that. Would you? If you were God? That seems very bad. So God could give us limited free will. We'd still have most of our free will. Most of us, it wouldn't affect us at all. but it would really make the world have a lot less evil, but not a little less, a lot less evil, misery, and suffering. Next thing the atheist could respond is God could have just made us more benevolent, empathetic, and sympathetic, so we'd be less likely to do bad things. Well, as I said, he could just tweak our genes, so it's kind of like we view everybody as a relative. That would maybe be one possible way. But it certainly seems like God could have made us, I mean, we already are empathetic and sympathetic, but could have made us in a way that we were even more empathetic and sympathetic and benevolent. Fourth, God could have given us greater abundance so we'd have fewer reasons to do bad things. So a lot of people think that a lot of the reason people do bad things is we're competing for limited resources. I think that certainly has been true in the past with primitive man, right? That they're in an area, there's limited resources, and they go to war and they kill each other. I mean, we even see this in the animal world with chimpanzees and things, very territorial. Why? You got your area, you want to eat the food in that area, right? You don't want anybody else coming in the area. There's not enough food to feed a lot more people in the area. You want that banana tree. You don't want anybody else taking the bananas from it. And so, but if God could have given us greater abundance, in fact I like this, not only greater abundance, but evenly distributed, so it seems fair at least, right? Then it seems like we have less reason to do bad things to our fellow man, and there would be less evil, misery, and suffering in the world, and we'd still have free will, right? Another one is God could have made us less susceptible to diseases and injuries. We still have free will, but we cut out a lot of the evil, misery, and suffering. I mean, a lot of the suffering in the world has to do with diseases and injuries, doesn't it? I mean, think about how many people really end up sometime in their life coming down with diseases. Of course, the common disease when you get old is what? Cancer. Look at how many people are coming down. One of my friends died recently. I grew up with him as a little boy in Chicago, and he moved out to LA, and I just kept in touch with him. My age. Dead.
Childhood cancer.
What?
Childhood cancer is getting worse.
Is it? Yeah, I know. It's still a small percentage, but it's actually getting worse. It's probably from environmental or pollution, environmental factors, right?
Yeah,
We don't really know the sources of all the cancers. By the way, there is some hope on this stuff. I don't know if you know, they are doing such incredible work on the genetic level. They're figuring out, they're starting to figure out what's triggering cancers and targeting ways to treat it. And I think in 20 or 30 years, they're going to eliminate most cancers. At least, they may not be able to stop you from getting it, but they'll be able to pretty much stop it in its tracks. I just hope I live long enough for that. That's the trick. I gotta live long enough that all these miracle cures actually work. We don't quite have them yet. So, all right, anyway. So it seems like that would be a lot less evil, misery, and suffering in the world if we weren't susceptible to disease and injuries. We mentioned in our list, God could have made his presence and teachings obvious and clear. I just think people would be less likely to do especially the really bad things, and there'd be a lot less evil, misery, and suffering if we knew there really was a God and there really were consequences meted out by God if we keep doing these bad things. I think most people are rational enough to change their behavior, so we still have free will. We wouldn't always do the right thing, but there'd be a lot less evil, misery, and suffering in the world. The last one, arguably, is the biggest one. God could intervene in history more to prevent the greatest evils. If God did that, he could pretty much stop all the big wars, and that alone would have eliminated so much evil, misery, and suffering. So you guys know, for example, in World War II, it's very hard to get a good number how many people died in World War II, but we know it's many tens of millions. That we know for sure. Whether it's 60 million or not, it's hard to get really good numbers on this. Well, let me read you. So there's a professor named Louis Poyman. He didn't write our book, did he? Our book is a con. Okay, I get mixed up. Poyman actually, I've taught from his. He has intro books. He died some years ago, but he was a very prolific writer. Okay, so this is what Poyman said. Poyman said, he wrote this in 2001. He said, with or without the free will defense, many philosophers maintain that the problem of evil still persists. Some, like J.L. Mackie and William Rowe, by the way, we're going to talk about something William Rowe said later, and William Rowe contend that the burden of proof is on the theist to explain why God does not intervene in the suffering of the world. If by the mere presence of pressing of a button, I could have caused Hitler to have had a heart attack before starting World War II, I would have been obliged to do so. Why did God not intervene in 1939 and prevent the evil of World War II, including the Holocaust? Why didn't he intervene in the event described by Dostoevsky in which the mad general sent his hounds on the 8-year-old boy? I'm going to read this to you at the end, what Dostoevsky wrote. Why does he not intervene in the sufferings of millions all over the world? Perhaps some evil is impossible to prevent, but why is there so much of it? Couldn't an all-knowing God have foreseen the evil in this world and created one in which people do not commit the amount of evil that occurs in the world? So he's making the argument, if you just intervened and killed Hitler, tens of millions of people would have saved, including an awful lot of children. If you're an all-good God, it seems you would definitely do that, but it wasn't done. So the conclusion we might say from all of this is there are many ways that people could have free will, whether it's full free will or partial free will, and there still could be a lot less evil, misery, and suffering in the world. And if God's all good, he'd want there to be less evil, misery, and suffering. And if he's all powerful, he can put that into effect. Okay. You guys understand the arguments? So for the test, you're going to have an essay. And I'm going to actually say, what is the argument from evil? You lay this out. What are the two main theist defenses? And what are the responses the atheist would make? We've covered one of them, right? We got one more to go. The other defense is sometimes, there's a philosopher by the name of Hick, who he is a theist, he believes in God, but I should say he is very somewhat progressive, and doesn't go totally by Christian doctrine, but he believes in God, he is Christian, he was Christian, I don't know if he's still alive, I don't think he is. But he comes up with something called it's sometimes known as the theodicy defense. He calls it the theodicy defense. Theodicy really just means any defense against the argument from evil. That's all it really means. So it's pretty nondescript. I like to call it the character development defense, but another way to describe it is the soul development defense, or the soul-making defense. My characterization, the character development that's not in the literature, I made that up. Soul development is what most of the writers in the area talk. The soul development defense. So, what is this defense? The defense is that in the long run and overall, it's better to have this exact amount of evil than to have no evil or even any lesser amount of evil. Why? We need this amount of evil, both natural evil and moral evil, to best further our soul development. So the idea is, maybe, this is what Hicks says, look, he doesn't know. He says, but this makes sense. If there's a God, it might make sense that God is not concerned, this is not his biggest concern is not your temporary happiness on earth. Rather, what he's concerned is with the development of your good and moral character. And he says, look, this is in keeping with the way we kind of think about things. As adults, we teach our children to value morality over temporary pleasure, right? And he says, if that's true, if God's more concerned with our soul or character development than about our temporary happiness on earth, then we should notice something. Evil gives us opportunities to build good character. Why? Well, some people have argued that moral choices and moral struggles in and of themselves help build good character. But let's get even more specific. When there's a lot of evil, misery, and suffering in the world, it gives you a lot of opportunities to create and to enhance empathy and sympathy. It gives you opportunities to be courageous. It gives you opportunities to be compassionate. So this defense will say there is a lot of evil, misery, and suffering in the world. There's a lot of natural evil, there's a lot of moral evil. But we need that amount because it gives us the best opportunity for character development. Now, the way I wrote this on the board, let's just read. Perhaps God is not concerned with your temporary happiness on earth. Rather, God wants us to develop good moral character. A lot of evil, misery, and suffering gives us, now this is the key to the argument, the perfect amount of opportunities to act courageously and benevolently, and to develop our empathy, sympathy, and compassion. So the argument is, it has to be the perfect amount. Because at some point, evil, misery, and suffering isn't helping soul development. If you think about it, if there's just too much of it, people give up, right? They don't develop, they just kind of, they give up. In fact, you might say it hardens people more, right? That they just start doing more bad things when there's too much bad going around them. So it can't be there's unlimited amount of evil. You can't have unlimited opportunities, that would be too much. Good God wouldn't want us to everybody to suffer horribly. That doesn't make any sense. But he'd want to have a lot of evil, misery, and suffering. So the argument is, not that you should like this argument, that God knows the exact right amount for us to have on earth. He knows the exact right amount. That we need a lot of opportunities, but of course it can't be too much. And that because God's perfect, God has given us the perfect amount of opportunities. A lot, but it could be worse. He makes sure it's not worse than that. Does it make sense? Okay, if you understand this argument, raise your hand. Okay, does it make sense? Who thinks it's a pretty good argument? None of you, you're afraid to raise your hands. You go, Professor Firestone's here, right? No, he's going to go after it. You're right. Okay, so how could the atheist respond to it? Well, I'm actually going to say something to you guys that I'm going to give you an argument that I've never actually given to any other class. Because I'm writing a paper on this right now, and I'm going to try to get it published maybe this summer, but I'm having some other people look at it too. You always try to get other professors to look at it, make sure you are okay, and you're original. I want us to think about the defense, because I'm going to write a paper that it's logically inconsistent, and that's really bad. That's like self-contradictory, right? It claims that God wants you to exhibit good character, right? The whole assumption of this character development defense is maybe God wants you to develop good character. So it claims that that God wants you to develop good character, and so He's given us a lot of evil, misery, and suffering. But then think about it. If we really do good things in the world to make the world better, then we're taking away opportunities to other people because we've eliminated some of the evil, misery, and suffering in the world. That seems self-contradictory. God wants you to develop your good character. That's the whole assumption of this argument. But think about it. If you really do it, let's think you develop your character and you come up with cures. You came up with the polio vaccine. Somebody did, right? Polio got wiped out of our country and most of the world. You've done something really good, but what have you done? You've eliminated a lot of the evil, misery, and suffering. Well, if before you had the perfect amount of evil, misery, and suffering, you got a lot less now because of that medical discovery. And think about all the other medical discoveries. Well, it seems like you shouldn't have done it now. You've really screwed it up. You've developed your character to help mankind, and you've taken away opportunities for other people to develop your character. Well, you're going to say, something doesn't seem right here. If we had the perfect amount, then we should try to make things better. But God wants you to make things better. He wants you to develop your character. That seems to be self-contradictory. You guys kind of get this? Who understands the argument I'm making? It's kind of a cool argument. One of my students kind of made this argument in philosophy. He just said a very vague statement. He goes, isn't this kind of self-contradictory? I started thinking about it. I go, he's right. I'm going to write a paper on this. So that's actually one problem. I actually think the argument, I didn't realize this before. In some sense, it actually doesn't make sense. Yes?
I was wondering, isn't the world also like constantly changing? So as you develop vaccines, other like viruses and stuff are adapting and then becoming like diseases.
Well, maybe, but it seems like there's really great fluctuations. There's been, as I said, there's been some books written. There's way less when you get born, there's way greater chance now you're gonna live to adulthood than before. It's just radically different than before. There's way less percentage of evil, misery, and suffering in the world than there used to be. There's still a lot of evil, misery, and suffering, but it's just kind of, it's shockingly less. There's a lot less people killed in war than there used to be, believe it or not. Why? Well, there's more people killed in war in the last century, but we have so many more people than we used to. Percentage-wise, it's actually less. So, you know, when you kind of look through the numbers, I should get you the name of the person who wrote the book. I have the book at home that he goes through all this stuff. Okay, let's go to the next argument. So the next argument is that there could be a lot less evil, misery, and suffering, and there still could be enough opportunities for character development. So, again, the idea is, in America overall, do we have a lot less evil, misery, and suffering than they do in certain parts of Africa? Clearly. There's a lot of starvation, a lot of people are fleeing from war, a lot more people dying from AIDS, right? I mean, it's rough. I wouldn't want to live in some parts of Africa right now. It's pretty horrible stuff that's going on. And so, you might say, well, it seems like we have enough evil, misery, and suffering in our country. If that's okay, then we can have a lot less in other parts. And in fact, if we look at prior times in the history of of humankind, if we have enough in our earth now, we could have had a lot less before, and it would have been enough. And if you were a good God, you don't want there to be any extra suffering, right? If there are enough opportunities on earth now, then we had way too many before. And if there was the right amount before, then we don't have enough opportunities now. But it defeats the argument, because the argument is an all good God would make sure there's the exact right amount of suffering. But it doesn't seem like they both could be the exact right amount if they're radically different. You guys kind of get the argument? Well, let me give you the next argument, which is stronger than the last one I just gave you. The last argument is that there seems to be a lot of unnecessary suffering. Think about it. If you were an all-good and all-perfect God, you would not allow any unnecessary suffering. What do we mean unnecessary suffering? We could say any suffering that doesn't lead to character development. Because we'd say character development under this argument is necessary, right? Necessary to give us opportunities to develop our character. But if you could find, think about this, in the history of mankind, even one example where there was suffering that didn't aid character development, then it's unnecessary. And that's totally inconsistent with an all-good God, because an all-good God wouldn't want there to be even one instance of unnecessary suffering. You guys get the argument? Let's give a couple examples. So that William Rowe wrote a very famous article about this unnecessary suffering. And he gives the example, he gives what's known as the deer analogy. I think I wrote it down. Actually, he says a fawn. A fawn's, I guess, a baby deer, right? So pretend, it gets you more sympathy, right? Pretend there's a baby deer. And I'm going to add something you didn't even add to it. Let's pretend the deer's parents and brothers and sisters were all hunted down by hunters. They don't exist anymore. Okay? Well, I know it's not very sanitary, but all right. So the baby deer, lightning strikes the forest, and there's a big fire. A lot of the forest burns down, and the baby deer gets burned alive till it dies, and has horrible suffering while it's been burning. Can you imagine it? By the way, they've had people try to commit suicide by lighting themselves on fire and live through it, and they said, "Oh my God, I never imagined what the pain would be like there." Not a good move. Incredibly painful, they said. So the deer suffers horribly and dies. And there's no people to witness this. Doesn't have any family around either. So we're assuming nobody witnesses it. Nobody knows it. We didn't even know that deer existed. How does that aid character? How did that aid character development? How did that help anybody develop their character? Well, that seems to be unnecessary suffering if it didn't. Yes? Oh, we say that. Yeah. But we can, you can think of that. We can think of all these other examples. You go, all right, what about all the children that are born with horrible diseases and they die within a few years, because there's a lot of that goes around. Okay? What about all the children that are tortured or put to death, or are physically or mentally abused, and then die? Because there's a lot of that. You might say, well, they ended the character development for those people who witnessed it, for us. But doesn't their character development count? After all, the argument says that God cares about what? Your character development. Well, was it some people don't count? In fact, I told you this, it looks like over half the people that have ever been born on earth didn't even make it to adulthood. In other words, Gregory Paul did work on this, and he's not actually even a philosopher, but he wrote this article. It's a full philosophical article. And he did the research and he said, look at the free will defense and the character development defense are assuming that you get old enough that you can actually are responsible for your moral decisions. But if you're dying before the age of 5, as so many people have, you had no chance to develop your character, and you had no chance really to exhibit responsible free will that you would be morally responsible for. Which seems to just obliterate these defenses. If God is concerned with your character development, then God has to allow you to live long enough that you can develop morally. You can't be dying when you're 2 years old, or 3 years old, or 2 months old.
But it changes the families.
It does. We have already granted that. But doesn't that person count too?
No, it don't.
I mean, what is this, character development offense only for some of us? That is not consistent with this story. This story is God cares about all of our character development. But some people really never get a chance to do that, which seems to be inconsistent with this argument. Yeah, it does help the rest of us. The deer didn't even help anybody, right? So that's already unnecessary. But it does seem like, do we really need that child to die, and doesn't their character also count? It seems to me that it does count under this story, and if it does count, then the story doesn't make a lot of sense. God wants to develop our character, not everybody, actually, maybe not even most people. You're not old enough to get real opportunities to develop your character because you die too young. Do you guys get the force of this argument? If only one time in the history of mankind we can find some evil that doesn't aid in character development, this whole argument falls. Because that means there was unnecessary evil. Unnecessary in the sense it doesn't serve the higher purpose of character development. And that's inconsistent. Any unnecessary evil is inconsistent with an all-good God. Because an all-good God would not want there to be any evil that doesn't serve a higher purpose. How you guys doing? I want to end by reading you something, and you guys can think about this. So I told you I was going to read to you about from the Brothers Karamazov. By the way, anybody here ever read the Brothers Karamazov? It's one of the great novels. Who likes to read? Anybody like reading? Okay, so you guys who like reading, don't during the semester, but in the breaks. If you want really good reading. I read it some years ago. It's a novel. It's actually a murder mystery. I always think they should put like one of those 20-part special series on TV, because you can list some of the dialogue. So Dostoevsky is a Russian writer who wrote in the 1800s. He's one of the great writers. And this book is just so good. I mean, I started it. It's long. It's like 700 pages. It's funny. 650 pages are so good. Now 50 pages are boring. I don't know why he got this 50 pages. He started telling about somebody's life, and it just got boring. But the rest of the book is like really good if you like good books. I think it's one of the great books ever written. Well, in the book, he actually tells a story. Now, maybe we should tell you a little bit about Dostoevsky. It's kind of juicy. So, supposedly this is true. I've tried to check this. A lot of times when they have changes of regimes who's running a country, they actually have killed the intellectuals. That's what Trump's trying to do, actually. Purge the intellectuals, I'm not saying he's literally trying to kill us, but But they try to purge the intellectuals. Well, Dostoevsky was a well-known writer. He was an intellectual. He got sentenced to death, supposedly. Supposedly he did not believe in God, or at least had a lot of doubts about God. He was lined up in front of a firing squad with another guy, and right before they shot him dead, he got like a reprieve. They said, no, don't kill him. He found God, supposedly, at that moment. And the rest of his life didn't believe in God. But this is what's interesting. I think he struggled with it. Why? I think emotionally he believed in God, but intellectually he couldn't understand how there could be a God. And the reason, I'm playing amateur psychiatrist. Why do I think this? Because in the Brothers Karamazov, it's about 3 brothers. The issue is whether the oldest brother committed the murder. The second brother, Ivan, is an atheist. Is an atheist. The youngest brother, I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, Alyosha. Dostoevsky says the hero. He's the youngest. He's about 18 or 19, I think, in the story. And he's a very good person. He believes in God. He really is a nice. You can't help but like him. So this is a conversation that takes place between Ivan the atheist and his younger brother. And it seems to me when we look at the conversation, Ivan wins the conversation. We're only going to be able to read a little bit of it. But now this is based on something that Dostoevsky actually researched and found in history that occurred in Russia. So let's read this. He says, one picture, only one more, because it's so curious, so characteristic, and I have only just read it in some collection of Russian antiquities. I've forgotten the name, I must look it up. It was in the darkest days of serfdom at the beginning of the century, and long lived the liberator of the people. There were in those days a general of aristocratic connections, the owner of great estates. One of those men, somewhat exceptional, I believe, even then, who retiring from the service into a life of leisure are convinced that they've earned absolute power over the lives of their subjects. There were such men then. So our general settled on his property of 2,000 souls, lives in pomp, excuse me, and domineers over his poor neighbors as though they were dependents and buffoons. So you guys get the picture? This is a true story, supposedly. So a general retires, and they basically say, you're in charge of this town of 2,000 people, right? He has kennels of hundreds of hounds and nearly 100 dog boys, all mounted and in uniform. One day a serf boy, a little child of 8, threw a stone in play and hurt the paw of the general's favorite hound. Why is my favorite dog lame? He's told that the boy threw a stone that hurt the dog's paw. So you did it. The general looked the child up and down. Take him. He was taken. Taken from his mother and kept shut up all night. Early that morning, the general comes out on horseback with the hounds, his dependents, dog boys, and huntsmen, all mounted around him in full hunting parade. The servants are summoned for their edification, and in front of them all stands the mother of the child. The child is brought from the lockup. It's a gloomy, cold, foggy autumn day, a capital day for hunting. The general orders the child to be undressed. The child is stripped naked. He shivers, numb with terror, not daring to cry. Make him run, commands the general. Run, run, shout the dog boys. The boy runs. At him, yells the general, and he sets a whole pack of hounds on the child. The hounds catch him and tear him to pieces before his mother's eyes. Supposedly a true story. So I'm going to skip. I don't have time to read much of it, but let's just, this is Ivan speaking. He says, but then there are the children, and what am I to do about them? That's the question I can't answer. For the 100th time, I repeat, there are a number of questions, but I've only taken the children because in their case, what I mean is so unanswerably clear. Listen, if all must suffer to pay for the eternal harmony, so the eternal harmony, we might say, is for the greater good of character development. right? For the eternal harmony. If all must pay for the eternal harmony, what have children to do with it? Tell me, please. It's beyond all comprehension why they should suffer and why they should pay for the harmony. You guys get the argument? Yeah, maybe it helps other people develop their soul, but why should they suffer and not get a chance to develop their own soul or character? He says, you see, Alyosha, perhaps it really may happen that if I live to that moment, or rise again to see it, I too perhaps may cry aloud with the rest, looking at the mother embracing the child's torturer and saying, thou art just, O Lord. It's being sarcastic here. But I don't want to cry aloud then. While there is still time, I hasten to protect myself, and so I renounce the higher harmony altogether. It's not worth the tears of that one tortured child who beat itself on the breast with its little fist and prayed in its stinking outhouse with its unexpiated tears to dear, kind God. It's not worth it because those tears are unatoned for. They must be atoned for, or there can be no harmony. But how? How are you going to atone for them? Is it possible by their being avenged? But what do I care for avenging them? What do I care for a hell for oppressors? What good can hell do since those children have already been tortured? Besides, too high a price is asked for harmony. It's beyond our means to pay so much to enter on it. So I hasten to give back my entrance ticket. I think he's talking about heaven. To give back my entrance ticket. And if I'm an honest man, I'm bound to give it back as soon as possible. And that I'm doing. Oh, he's going to be sarcastic here. It's not God that I don't accept, Alyosha, only I must respectfully return him the ticket. So what's he arguing? He's arguing that if God allows little children to suffer, can you imagine the suffering by being torn apart by dogs? To suffer and die, he wants no part of that kind of God, because that is not an all-good God. And there is no excuse that's adequate that a good God would allow it. And you can't use the excuse, it's for some higher purpose like an eternal harmony that all works out in the end. Because the fact is, that little child of only 8 doesn't really get a chance to develop its soul and suffered horribly. And there can't be any excuse for that. Think about that.